5 truths. 5 truths, not theories, not speculation from a comment section. 5 things that have been established on the record in the Lynette Hooker investigation, and almost every one of them surfaced in the same place first. Not on a network morning show, not in a police press conference, on a podcast microphone weeks before the major outlets caught up. One of those truths is a timestamp on a surveillance camera that should not exist if the official account of April 4th is accurate. One is a weather report that quietly dismantles the words rough waters. One is a span of 24 hours that nobody can explain. One is a single sentence in a private message that contradicts everything that came before it. And the last one, the one we are saving for the end, is 11 words from a 70-something mother in Michigan spoken directly into Ashley Banfield's microphone that may be the most devastating thing said in this case so far. By now you know the broad strokes, you know the boat, you know the dinghy, you know the husband who walked out of a Bahamian jail after 5 days without a single charge. What you may not know is how much of the picture has been confirmed since then, piece by piece, source by source, and how consistently one reporter has been ahead of the entire National Press Corps in confirming it. Because here is the thing about this case. The story Brian Hooker told has never changed in its conclusion. Lynette fell. The sea took her. It was an accident. But the details around that conclusion, the times, the water, the lights, the words, have been tested now. Tested by meteorologists, tested by marine tracking data, tested by federal investigators with dive teams and cadaver dogs, and tested relentlessly by a journalist with 36 years of crime reporting behind her who decided early on that this story deserved more scrutiny than it was getting. Tonight, we walk through what that scrutiny found. 5 truths in order, each one confirmed, each one sourced, each one harder to explain than the last. We are not going to tell you what they add up to. We don't have to. By the time you hear what Lynette's mother said, you will have done that math yourself. The reporter who got there first. Before we get to the 5 truths themselves, you need to understand why Ashley Banfield's name keeps coming up in this case. Because it is not an accident and it is not hype. Banfield has been reporting crime for more than 3.5 decades. She covered courtrooms before some of the people commenting on this case were born. And when Lynette Hooker vanished off Elbow Cay in early April, Banfield's Drop Dead Serious podcast did something that most national outlets did not do in those first chaotic weeks. It treated the husband's account as a claim to be tested rather than a fact to be repeated. Go back and look at the sequence. When much of the early coverage was still framing this as a tragic boating accident, Banfield was already pulling at the threads, the weather, the timeline, the geography of the Sea of Abaco. When she reported that investigators were treating the sailboat itself as a potential crime scene, that sounded aggressive. Weeks later, the United States Coast Guard seized that sailboat in a surveillance and interdiction operation 40 nautical miles off the Florida coast and towed it to a federal station for forensic processing. When she reported that this had become a suspected murder investigation, that sounded premature. Then, a United States official confirmed to CBS News that the case is being handled as a possible foreign murder of a U.S. national. That is the pattern. Banfield reports it, the networks confirm it days or weeks later. It has happened enough times in this case that her reporting has earned a particular kind of weight. Not the weight of proof, but the weight of a track record, and she has not been gentle about her conclusions. In her assessment of Brian Hooker's account, Banfield has been blunt in a way almost no broadcast journalist has been willing to be. She has publicly characterized his story as fundamentally untrue, and she has backed that characterization with specifics, pieces of evidence she says contradict him point by point. We are going to walk through those specifics tonight, and we will label each one for what it is. Multi-outlet confirmed fact, single source reporting attributed to Banfield, or analysis. One more thing about her access. Banfield has not just been ahead on documents and data. She has been ahead on people. Lynette's family, the people closest to this loss, have chosen her microphone repeatedly as the place to say the things they cannot say anywhere else. Keep that in mind. It matters at the end of this story. So those are the stakes. A retired couple living their dream aboard a 46-foot sailboat called Soulmate. a wife of roughly 25 years who has now been missing for more than 2 months, a husband who has never wavered from a single word accident, and a reporter who has spent those same 2 months methodically testing that word against everything she can verify. Let's start where Brian Hooker's story starts, because to understand what contradicts his account, you first have to hear his account in full. Truth 1. The night of April 4th, Saturday, April 4th, 2026. The Abacos. In the northern Bahamas, according to what Brian Hooker himself told friends in a phone call later shared publicly, the day began at anchor in Aunt Pat's Bay on the western side of Elbow Cay, where the couple's sailboat Soulmate was moored. From there, by his own telling, he and Lynette took their dinghy out for a classic Abaco Saturday, a stop at Tahiti Beach, the famous sandbar at the southern tip of Elbow Cay, where a floating barge bar serves drinks to boaters at low tide. From there, the couple made their way to the Abaco Inn, a small beachfront resort and restaurant on Elbow Cay, a few minutes from the village of Hopetown. This part is not in dispute. Multiple outlets, including Fox News and CBS News, confirmed the couple was seen dining and drinking at the Abaco Inn that Saturday evening, and CBS reported that investigators later visited the inn themselves, because as far as the public record shows, it is the last place Lynette Hooker was seen alive by anyone other than her husband. Think about that for a moment, because it is the foundation of everything that follows. After the Abaco Inn, every single detail of what happened to Lynette Hooker comes from exactly one person. Here is that person's account, assembled from what Bahamian police said he told them and from his own statements. At around 7:30 in the evening, the couple left and boarded their dinghy, an 8-foot hard-bottom inflatable, a small tender of the kind cruisers use to shuttle between shore and an anchored boat. They set off towards Soulmate. Somewhere along that short run, Brian Hooker says conditions turned. Waves, wind. By his account, Lynette went off the boat and into the water, and this is where his exact wording matters, because he has used a phrase that has followed this case ever since. He initially told investigators his wife bounced off the dinghy in the rough water, and according to his account, she did not go into the water empty-handed. She went in with the key. The dinghy's ignition key, he said, was with Lynette when she fell, and on a small tender with a kill switch system, no key means no engine. In one moment, by his telling, his wife was in the water and his boat was dead in the water. What he says happened next has been described by police and elaborated by Hooker himself in that recorded call with a fellow boater. He says he threw a flotation cushion toward her. He says he tried to anchor the dinghy, and that by the time the anchor held, he was already a quarter mile to half a mile away from where she went in. He says the current took him. Royal Bahamas Police summarized his statement in one line. Strong currents carried her away and he lost sight of her. Then comes the long, dark middle of his story, hours of drifting and paddling with a single oar across the Sea of Abaco alone in the night. The dinghy, he says, eventually carried him roughly 4 miles from where Lynette went in until he washed up on a small, rocky stretch of shoreline near the Marsh Harbor boatyards on Great Abaco, a different island entirely from the one he left. The arrival is corroborated. A boatyard employee described to Fox News Digital finding an exhausted man on the adjacent beach in the early morning hours, a man who said he had been at a bar on a quay with his wife, that they had gone out into rough weather and that she had gone overboard. The time, confirmed by Bahamian authorities, approximately 4 o'clock in the morning, Sunday, April 5th. Lynette Hooker was reported missing, and a search involving Bahamian police, the Royal Bahamas Defense Force, and volunteer rescue crews began around 4:30. Now do the arithmetic Brian Hooker's own account demands. If Lynette went into the water shortly after a 7:30 departure and the search began around 4:30 in the morning, then by the time anyone other than her husband was looking for her, she had been in the ocean, by his own framing in that recorded call, for roughly 8 hours. 8 hours at night in April in open water. That is the account. That has always been the account. He repeated its essentials in a public statement describing himself as heartbroken over a boating accident in unpredictable seas and high winds. And he told NBC News directly weeks later that he never harmed Lynette and never would. So that is truth one.
I said I've never harmed Lynette and I never would harm Lynette, and I want to find Lynette.
And notice what kind of truth it is. It is not a truth about what happened to Lynette Hooker. It is a truth about what Brian Hooker says happened. It is confirmed, multi-outlet, on the record, that this is his story. 7:30 departure, rough water, a fall, a lost key, a dead engine, a 4-mile drift, a 4 a.m. arrival. Lock those details in. Every one of the remaining 4 truths is going to press against one of them. And the first detail to crack was the water itself. Truth 2, the water that wouldn't cooperate. Brian Hooker's account lives or dies on the sea conditions. Rough waters are not a backdrop in his story. They are the mechanism. The waves are what put Lynette overboard. The wind is what separated them. The current is what carried him 4 miles away. Take away the violent water, and the story does not have a cause anymore. So the water became the first thing serious people tested. Start with what is verifiable. CBS News put the question to its own meteorologist, Andrew Kozak, who analyzed conditions around Hopetown that evening. His assessment, genuinely challenging weather for small boat operation. Sustained winds in the range of 15 to 25 knots, gusts at times exceeding 40 miles per hour, scattered showers. On its face, that sounds like it supports the husband's account. But Kozak's analysis came with a qualifier that changes everything, and it connects to a piece of evidence Brian Hooker created himself. After Lynette disappeared, Hooker shared annotated screenshots with friends and fellow boaters, maps from a marine navigation app marked up to show the route he says the dinghy took that night. CBS News obtained them, and those maps, made by his own hand, placed the incident in shallow water under 10 feet at high tide, protected water inside the Sea of Abaco, not open ocean. And as the CBS analysis noted, the impact of even strong wind in shallow, sheltered water is significantly less than on the open sea. Wind makes chop. It does not easily make the kind of violent, ejecting wave action in 10 feet of protected water that his account requires. Ashley Banfield has gone further. In her reporting on Drop Dead Serious, she has stated flatly that the evidence shows the seas were calm in the specific area where Brian Hooker says his wife went overboard, and she has paired that with one of the most quoted assessments anyone has made in this case, publicly characterizing the entirety of his account as a lie. That is Banfield's reporting and Banfield's characterization, and we attribute it to her by name. But notice that her single-source claim and the multi-outlet meteorological record are pointing the same direction. Whatever the wind was doing across the broader Abacos that night, the specific spot where Brian Hooker says this happened was shallow, sheltered, and far less violent than the phrase rough waters suggests. Then there are the people who actually know these waters and these boats. Blaine Stevenson, a sailor who befriended the Hookers in Florida in 2023 and who later released a recorded phone call in which Brian Hooker described that night in his own words, told interviewers that when he sat with the story, it simply did not hold together as a linear sequence of events. The details an experienced boater would fixate on bothered him most. The life vests that stayed in the dinghy, the way Hooker described the emergency flares. Stevenson said the flares, in particular, made no sense to him. These are not armchair detectives. These are cruisers who have made that exact kind of nighttime tender run themselves. And then there is the data, because while human memory can flex, marine tracking systems do not. Fox News Digital obtained records from the vessel tracking service Vessel Finder covering Soulmate's automatic identification system, the transponder that broadcasts a vessel's identity and position. On the night of April 4th, Soulmate's AIS went dark at 9:29 p.m. It did not transmit again until 8:40 the next morning, a blackout of more than 11 hours, spanning almost exactly the window in which Lynette Hooker vanished, and her husband says he was drifting alone across the Sea of Abaco. Sit with the timing of that. 9:29 p.m. is roughly 2 hours after the couple left the Abaco Inn. By Brian Hooker's account, at 9:29 he was not on Soulmate. He was miles away, adrift in a dead dinghy. So who or what silenced the sailboat's transponder that night? There are technical explanations the defense would offer: power management, equipment behavior at anchor. But the question has been put to maritime experts precisely because the alternative explanation is so much darker, that someone was aboard Soulmate that night after the moment Lynette supposedly never made it back to her. Hold that thought. Hold it, specifically, next to the 7:30 departure time, because later in this video, we are going to lay a different set of timestamps directly on top of this blackout window. Timestamps from a camera that nobody aboard either boat knew was watching. That is the central piece of Banfield's reporting in this case, and we are building to it. But first, Truth 2 needs its conclusion, and it is this. The element of Brian Hooker's story that does all the work, the violent, chaotic sea, has been examined by a network meteorologist, by experienced sailors, by tracking data, and by the one journalist who has been consistently ahead of this case. None of them found water that behaves the way his story needs it to behave. Shallow, sheltered, chop, not chaos, and the only vessel that could have electronically vouched for where things were that night went silent for 11 hours, which brings us to the question the water cannot answer. If the sea did not keep Brian Hooker away from the search for his wife, what did? Because what he did in the hours and days after he washed ashore is Truth 3, and it is the one that made his own friends stop defending him. Truth 3, 24 hours on Soulmate. There is a version of this story where everything that happened on the water is exactly as Brian Hooker described it, and what he did afterwards still does not make sense. That is what makes Truth 3 so corrosive to his account. It does not require you to disbelieve a single word about the dinghy. It only requires you to watch what he did next. The source for this truth is not an enemy, it is a friend. Blaine Stevenson and his wife met the Hookers in late 2023, anchored near each other on Florida's Gulf Coast. The friendship was real. Shared anchorages, shared military background, the kind of bond cruisers form. When LYNETTE vanished, the Stevensons did what friends do. They reached out, they tried to help coordinate from afar, and Blaine got Brian on the phone 2 days after the disappearance. He recorded that call, he later said, so there would be an accurate record of Brian's account to help the search. Then, as the days passed and the account refused to add up, he made the recording public. From Stevenson's account given to Fox News Digital, here is the timeline of Brian Hooker's first days as the husband of a missing woman. He washes ashore at Marsh Harbor around 4 a.m. on April 5th and raises the alarm. Search and rescue takes him back out to the area where he says LYNETTE went in, and he searches alongside them for roughly 3 to 4 hours. Then they return him to Soulmate, his anchored sailboat, and there, by his friends telling, Brian Hooker stayed for approximately 24 hours on the boat, while the search for his wife of a quarter-century continued on the water around him. Stevenson described it with the bafflement of a man who wanted a better explanation and never got one. The incident happened Saturday night. He is ashore at 4, he searches for a few hours, and then he sits on his boat for nearly a full day until rescuers bring his dinghy back to him. From there, Stevenson says, Hooker moved to the Conch Inn in Marsh Harbor on April 6th and stayed there until Bahamian police arrested him on April 8th. What gnawed at Stevenson just as much was what Brian did not do in all those hours. By his telling, Hooker never volunteered new details, never walked anyone through the night again with fresh urgency, never gave searchers more than the same outline he gave at the beginning. Stevenson eventually said the quiet part out loud in an interview. Even if Brian believed his wife was gone, didn't he want closure? Now layer in the detail that turned this from strange into staggering, and this one was broken by Fox News Digital and confirmed by CBS News. Mounted on Soulmate was a FLIR system, a marine thermal imaging camera, a $33,000 piece of equipment built to detect heat signatures on dark water. It is almost literally a machine designed for one job above all others, finding a human being in the ocean at night. Boaters install it for exactly this nightmare. Daniel Danforth, another friend of the couple, knew the system was aboard because Brian Hooker had personally shown it off to him when they were docked together in New Orleans back in 2023. Danforth told reporters the FLIR would have been his own first move if he were trying to rescue someone from dark water.
My first choice, like if I was trying to rescue somebody, but like the next day, it would have even been a benefit to the search and rescue part because that's what it does. It's a thermal heat-seeking camera.
By every account on the record, in the hours and days after LYNETTE disappeared, the hours Brian Hooker spent sitting on the very boat the camera was mounted to, that thermal camera was never deployed in the search for her. It gets worse, because the question is not just whether Brian used the camera, it is whether he ever told the professional searchers it existed. Danforth says he is the one who informed the Coast Guard about the FLIR system in early May, a month into the case, and he says investigators told him it was the first they had heard of it. The first.
He had contacted me, and we met in New Orleans here about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And I told them about it, and they were very interested. That was the first they had heard about that system being on the boat.
Meaning that through the entire initial search, through the Bahamian operation, through the days when finding Lynette alive was still conceivable, the man closest to her never mentioned to anyone that his boat carried a heat-seeking camera with, according to Danforth, a self-tracking feature and the ability to record activity around the vessel. And that last detail is its own quiet bombshell. CBS News reported that the FLIR system can operate with cloud-connected memory. Investigators are now processing that camera as part of the federal probe, because if it was recording, or if its cloud history preserved anything from the night of April 4th, then the boat Brian Hooker sat on for 24 hours may have been documenting its own surroundings the entire time. So State Truth 3 plainly, with every part of it multi-outlet confirmed. After his wife went into the water, Brian Hooker searched for a few hours, then withdrew to his sailboat and remained there for roughly a day. Aboard that sailboat was a $33,000 thermal camera engineered to find people in dark water. He did not use it. He did not tell the Coast Guard it existed. A friend did a month later, and investigators had no idea. Brian Hooker has not been charged with anything, and no innocent explanation theory is off the table. Shock, exhaustion, paralysis, grief. People break in strange ways, but his own friends, the people who started out defending him, are the ones who put this timeline on the record, and they did it because of one more thing he said, a single sentence typed into a message that quietly tore a hole in the story you heard in Truth 1. Truth 4, the message that changed the story. On Monday, April 6th, 2 days after Lynette vanished, 2 days before his arrest, Brian Hooker's phone lit up with a message from Daniel Danforth. Danforth had seen the headlines and reached out, the way you do when a friend's life detonates. The exchange that followed was later shared with CBS News and CNN, and one sentence in it has become arguably the single most analyzed piece of text in this entire case. Describing the moment Lynette went into the water, Brian Hooker wrote to his friend that the wind blew him away from her, and that she swam towards the sailboat before they lost sight of each other around sundown. Read that again. She swam towards the sailboat. Now hold it against the account from Truth 1. The account Bahamian police say he gave them, the account in his public statement. In that version, Lynette falls into rough water and strong currents carry her away. She is a victim of the sea, swept off helpless, while her husband is dragged in the opposite direction. In the message to Danforth, she is something else entirely, a swimmer, oriented, moving with purpose, heading for soulmate, their home, the fixed point of safety in the dark, under her own power. Those are not two phrasings of one event, they are two different events. A woman swept away by current and a woman swimming deliberately toward a destination are not the same picture, and the differences are not cosmetic. They change where she would be. A body carried by current ends up where the current goes. A swimmer making for an anchored sailboat ends up somewhere along the line between where she fell and where that boat sat, and possibly at the boat itself. Every search grid, every drift model, every diver deployment depends on which of those two stories is true. If investigators spent April searching the path of a drifting victim, while the husband's own private message described a swimmer headed for the anchorage, then the contradiction is not a detail. It is the difference between searching the right water and the wrong water. And remember who Lynette Hooker was in the water. Her own mother told the Associated Press that the family grew up around lakes and boats, that Lynette had spent her whole life swimming and sailing. Her daughter, Carly Aylesworth, said from the very first week that her mother was an experienced mariner and that the idea of her simply falling off a boat never sat right. The swam towards the sailboat message does not describe a helpless person. It describes the capable woman her family knew, which makes the official version, the one where the sea simply takes her, even harder for them to accept. The rest of the message exchange has drawn its own scrutiny. In those same texts, Hooker described drifting and paddling with one oar for roughly 7 hours before reaching shore. Sit that next to the 8-hour arithmetic of his own recorded account and next to the 11-hour AIS blackout, and you start to understand why investigators keep using the word inconsistencies. Danforth himself compared what Brian was telling him with the emerging news reports and concluded in his words that the stories did not really match up. And CBS reported one more discordant note from those days. In the middle of the exchange about his missing wife, Hooker paused to congratulate Danforth on a recent sailboat purchase, a pivot in tone that family and friends found chilling, whatever it ultimately means. Then, in June, came the recording that pushed Truth 4 somewhere darker. Fox News Digital reported on a portion of the Stevenson phone call in which Brian Hooker, describing the chaos of that night in his own rambling words, talks about taking waves over the dinghy, bailing it out repeatedly, the key not being attached to him, and then a phrase that stopped investigators and armchair analysts alike when, as he put it, they were trying to get back in the boat. They, back in. Stevenson's read, shared publicly, is that the sentence appears to place Brian Hooker himself in the water that night. A detail that exists in no version of his official account where he never leaves the dinghy at all. So Truth 4 stands like this. To police, she was swept away by current. To one friend in writing, she swam toward the sailboat. To another friend on a recording, language that seems to put both of them in the water, struggling to climb back aboard. 3 audiences, 3 versions, one man telling all of them. None of this proves what happened to Lynette Hooker, but it demolishes something Brian Hooker badly needs, which is the idea that his account has been simple, stable, and consistent. It has not. And the people who documented that are not detectives or prosecutors. They are his friends, holding up his own words. Which brings us finally to the evidence that does not come from anyone's words at all. No memory, no phrasing, no grief or shock to account for. A machine on a dock doing the only thing machines do. Recording. This is the heart of Ashley Banfield's reporting on this case, and it is the reason this video exists. The lights and the watch. Everything you have heard so far has one limitation. It runs through human beings. Brian Hooker's accounts, his friends' recollections, even the meteorology is interpretation. What Banfield's reporting introduced into this case is different in kind. It is a camera that was never supposed to matter, a private surveillance camera in the lubbers' quarters area of the Sea of Abaco, the scatter of cays near where Soulmate sat at anchor, and it was pointed, as fate would have it, toward the water where this story unfolded. According to Banfield's reporting on Drop Dead Sirius, that camera recorded light activity in the vicinity of the anchored Soulmate on the night of April 4th, and the timing of those light events is the problem. The first burst of light appears roughly 17 minutes after the couple's 7:30 departure from the Abaco Inn. Call it about 7:45 in the evening. On its own, that one is almost compatible with the official story. You could argue it captures the dinghy's approach or some unrelated vessel. It is the later activity that has no comfortable home in Brian Hooker's account. Banfield's reporting describes additional light events near Soulmate around midnight and after, deep into the window when, by his telling, the dinghy was dead, Lynette was gone, and he was drifting miles away toward Marsh Harbor. We attribute those specifics to Banfield's reporting and to Banfield's reporting alone. The major networks have not independently published the camera's timeline, but her description of lights near the boat well after the supposed accident has circulated widely precisely because no one, not the family, not the experts, and so far not the husband, has offered an innocent explanation for what would be making light around an empty anchored sailboat in the middle of the night. Now set those lights beside the data point you already have. Soulmate's AIS transponder went silent at 9:29 that night and stayed silent until morning. A boat that is supposed to be empty, electronically dark, sitting alone at anchor, and a nearby camera per Banfield catching light activity around it past midnight. 2 machines, 2 records, neither one of them grieving, confused, or in shock, and together they ask the question this entire case now turns on. Was somebody on or around that sailboat during the hours Brian Hooker says nobody could have been? Banfield has reported one more detail that sharpens the question into a point. And again, this is her sourcing attributed to her. She has reported that when investigators went through Soulmate, they recovered Lynette's Apple Watch aboard the boat. The same watch, per Banfield's reporting, that Lynette appeared to be wearing that evening when the couple went ashore. Think about what that object means if both halves of that reporting hold. If Lynette wore the watch to dinner, and the watch ended up back on the sailboat, then something traveled from Lynette's wrist to Soulmate after the Abaco Inn. And by Brian Hooker's account, Lynette herself never made it back to Soulmate at all. Banfield drew the conclusion in a single sentence on her podcast, and it is the kind of sentence that does not need decoration. If she bounced off the back of that dinghy, she never made it to Soulmate. The watch, the lights, the silent transponder, each one is a separate arrow, and they are all pointing at the same 46 feet of fiberglass, which is exactly where federal investigators ended up pointing to. Banfield reported weeks ago that authorities were treating Soulmate not as a missing woman's home, but as a potential crime scene. At the time, that was a podcast claim. Then the Coast Guard seized the boat at sea in a planned operation, hauled it to a federal station, and began processing it. Hull, electronics, thermal camera, everything, as evidence in what a U.S. official now openly calls a possible murder investigation. Be precise about what this is and is not. The light timestamps are single source. The watch is single source. They are Banfield's reporting, and we have labeled them as such every time. But remember the pattern from the beginning of this video. In this case, Banfield's single source reporting has a habit of becoming everyone's confirmed reporting on a delay. The crime scene framing did, the murder investigation framing did, and the physical evidence that could prove or demolish the lights and the watch, the camera footage, the FLIR system's cloud memory, the boat itself, is no longer floating in the Bahamas. It is sitting in a federal facility in Florida, being taken apart by people who do not talk to podcasts or networks. They talk to prosecutors. That is the reveal, and it is bigger than any one detail. The story of April 4th is no longer Brian Hooker's to tell. For 2 months, every fact in this case had to pass through him. His memory, his maps, his messages, that monopoly is over. The machines kept their own version of that night, and the people now reading the machines work for the United States government. The machinery of a federal case. To understand where this case stands today, you have to appreciate how unusual the last 6 weeks have been. Missing person cases in foreign waters usually fade. This one has done the opposite. It has escalated step by deliberate step into a full federal apparatus, and every escalation traces back to the same route. The data would not match the man. Start with the GPS. In late May, CBS News broke the story that digital forensics had produced something investigators could not ignore. Location data pulled from one of Brian Hooker's own electronic devices showing a track of movement on the night of April 4th that does not align with the account he gave. According to a U.S. official, the data shows the device out on the water, stopping at a point in the Sea of Abaco and then returning, not drifting helplessly along a 4-mile current line. Moving, stopping, coming back. NBC News added the detail that lands hardest for Lynette's family. Investigators concluded that Hooker's account had them searching the wrong area of the Sea of Abaco during those first critical weeks. The wrong area. Every hour of those early searches, every diver and aircraft and volunteer deployed against a map drawn from one man's story, a story his own device appears to contradict. That single finding reopened everything. The Royal Bahamas Police Force granted permission, and in the first week of June, the United States Coast Guard came back to the Abacos in force. The cutter Margaret Norvell arrived in Marsh Harbor carrying a specialized dive team. Over the days that followed, the operation deployed divers, remotely operated underwater vehicles, drones, and a cadaver dog, Maggie, on loan with her handlers from the Broward County Sheriff's Office, across newly identified areas of interest, including waters northwest of Lubbers Quarters Cay, the same neighborhood as the surveillance camera from Banfield's reporting. Investigators were seen working the shoreline near an abandoned harbor as well. This was not a rescue posture. 2 months after a disappearance, with a cadaver dog on the boat, everyone involved understood what they were looking for. And while the divers searched, the evidence kept accumulating in federal custody. The sailboat's soulmate had already been seized back in May, taken roughly 40 nautical miles off Melbourne, Florida, in what the Coast Guard itself described as a complex surveillance and interdiction operation, then brought to Fort Pierce and later moved to Fort Lauderdale for processing. Now, during the June operation, the Coast Guard Investigative Service took custody of the final character in Brian Hooker's story, the 8-foot dinghy itself. CBS News cameras captured the moment. An investigator aboard the little boat surveying it, holding up a life jacket, a cadaver dog working nearby, as the dinghy was ferried out to a Coast Guard cutter. The boat Lynette allegedly bounced off of is now itself evidence, headed for forensic examination. The June search ended without finding Lynette. The Coast Guard formally concluded its on-water mission in the Bahamas and announced that its investigative arm, CGIS, continues the case. Read the official language carefully because it tells you everything about trajectory. The investigation remains active, with forensic analysis of vessels, electronics, and other evidence ongoing. Vessels, plural. Soulmate and the dinghy, electronics. The devices that produce the GPS track, the FLIR camera, and whatever its cloud memory holds. And a U.S. official has now told CBS News on the record what category this case sits in. It is being investigated as a possible foreign murder of a U.S. national. That phrase is not rhetoric. It is a jurisdictional designation, the legal doorway through which the United States can prosecute a homicide that happened in another country's waters if the evidence ever supports a charge. There are stranger threads still being pulled. CBS News obtained a Coast Guard memo seeking the occupants of a mystery sailboat that may have been moored next to Soulmate on the night Lynette disappeared. Potential witnesses nobody has publicly identified. Investigators have also taken an interest in the couple's life before the Bahamas. A neighbor from Michigan told interviewers the FBI contacted her about home camera footage from the months before the couple set sail. And through all of it, the man at the center has gone quiet in a new way. His original Bahamian attorney, Terrell Butler, once spoke freely about his client's categorical denials. When CBS News reached the attorney, who later took over stateside communications, she hung up the phone. And in Banfield's most recent reporting, again attributed to her, sources say Brian Hooker is now refusing to cooperate with the suspected murder investigation altogether, a development she dissected on her podcast with defense attorney Mark Geragos, exploring what it signals when the husband at the center of a case like this stops talking to the people looking for his wife. He remains in the official record exactly what Bahamas Police Commissioner Shanta Knowles said he was when he walked free in April, a suspect. Uncharged, presumed innocent, and entitled to every protection that word carries, and also, 2 months later, still the only living person who claims to know what happened to Lynette Hooker in a case where federal investigators have stopped relying on what he claims, what the family knew before April. There is one more layer of confirmed reporting to put on the table before you hear from Lynette's mother, and it is the layer the family has been pointing to since the first week. The history, because the people who knew this marriage from the inside have never described the night of April 4th as a bolt from the blue. Carly Aylesworth is Lynette's daughter and Brian Hooker's stepdaughter, and her account has been remarkably consistent across NBC News, CNN, ABC News, Fox News, and The Today Show. She learned of her mother's disappearance in a phone call from her stepfather hours after he reported it, and what struck her first was not what he said, but how he said it. She described his delivery as monotone and relaxed, and said the call left her in shock twice over. Once at the news and once at the voice delivering it. From that very first conversation, she has said, his account raised questions for her that never stopped multiplying. Why he didn't do this, why he didn't do that, how a woman like her mother drowned or floated away at all. She has also been careful and fair in public, telling CNN after his release that if a thorough investigation of all the facts concluded it was an accident, she would have to live with that, but that she did not believe the story was over. It was Aylesworth who told NBC News in plain terms that her mother and Brian had a history of not getting along, especially when they drank. That history is not just family memory. There is paper behind it. NBC News obtained a police report from Kentwood, Michigan, dating back to 2015, documenting a night when Lynette and Brian Hooker each accused the other of assault. Lynette was the one arrested that night on an assault and battery complaint, but the prosecution went nowhere. The warrant was denied for insufficient evidence as to who started the altercation. A decade-old report, mutual accusations, no conviction on either side, and on its own it proves nothing about April 4th. But it does establish in an official record that this marriage had at least one night violent enough for police to be standing in the middle of it. Then there are the statements from the couple's own daughter, Carly Hooker, and these, reported by News Nation, are among the heaviest in the entire case. Carly said she was aware of threats her father had allegedly made years earlier, threats that, in her description, mirrored the circumstances of her mother's disappearance. She said she was fairly sure he had threatened it multiple times, that there had been actions in the past that hurt her mother, and that the timing of it all now felt like grim coincidence, because in her words, he had said he was going to do this, and now it was happening. News Nation has also reported, citing family and friends, that Lynette had attempted to leave the marriage before. These are allegations from a daughter, not findings from a court, and we present them as exactly that, but understand their weight in context. This is not an internet sleuth pattern matching from a distance. This is the couple's child on the record by name describing her own father. So before the final truth, take stock of who has publicly questioned Brian Hooker's account. His stepdaughter, his daughter, his wife's mother. The friends who recorded him released his words and urged him to be more forthcoming. Not one of the people closest to this man and this marriage has stood up publicly to vouch for his version of April 4th. In 2 months of saturation coverage, the loudest defense of Brian Hooker has come from Brian Hooker. That silence around him is not evidence in any courtroom. But in the court of the people who knew Lynette best, the verdict was being whispered long before any podcast said it aloud, and one member of that family is now done whispering. Truth 5, a mother's words. We told you at the start that the last truth would not be a timestamp or a data point. It is not. It is a mother. And before you hear what she said, you should know who she is, because Darlene Hamlet has been present in this case since the very first week, measured, careful, and almost unbearably restrained for a woman living through it. When her son-in-law was arrested back in April, Hamlet did not celebrate or accuse. She told the Associated Press she was glad to hear of the arrest, but had many unanswered questions. And then she said something that has quietly shaped how everyone close to this case thinks about it. Her family, she said, grew up on the water. Lynette spent her entire life around lakes and boats, sailing and swimming. It was a mother's gentle way of saying what her granddaughter Carly Aylesworth said more directly. Women like Lynette do not just fall off boats and vanish. For 2 months, Darlene Hamlet carried that restraint through every stage of this nightmare, through the arrest and the release, through the seizure of the boat her daughter called home, through the June search, the divers, the sonar, the cadaver dog, and through the moment that search ended with no answer, no recovery, nothing to bury. There is a particular cruelty in that outcome for a parent. A search that ends without finding anything does not close a wound. It seals it open. And when that search ended, Darlene Hamlet and her husband Bill chose where to speak. Not a network anchor desk. They sat down with Ashley Banfield, the reporter who had treated their daughter's case as a homicide investigation when much of the world was still calling it an accident. And on Drop Dead Serious, Lynette's mother said the sentence we have been holding back this entire video. He took her last breath and threw her away like trash.
He took her last breath, and then he threw her away like trash.
11 words. We are not going to embellish them because nothing we could add would carry a fraction of their weight. Understand exactly what they are and what they are not. They are not a finding. They are not evidence. Brian Hooker has been charged with nothing, and a grieving mother's conviction, however piercing, is not proof of anything. But they are also not a rumor, not a tabloid paraphrase, not an anonymous comment. That is Lynette Hooker's mother, on the record by name, into a microphone telling the world precisely what she believes was done to her daughter, and choosing the words last breath and trash to do it. Think about the distance between the woman who said that and the woman from April. the one who told a wire service only that she had questions. 2 months of confirmed truths stand between those two women. The water that would not cooperate, the 24 hours on Soulmate, the thermal camera nobody mentioned, the message about swimming toward the sailboat, the lights, the watch, the GPS track that sent searchers to the wrong sea. Darlene Hamlet heard every one of those truths land one by one the same way you have tonight. The sentence she spoke is where they carried her. Where they carry you is your own conclusion to draw what they took home. So here is where the case of Lynette Hooker stands, and here is the open question that everything now hangs on. When the Coast Guard pulled out of the Bahamas in June, the cameras showed what they did not find. No remains, no recovery. To a casual observer, it looked like an ending. Another search wound down, another case going cold. But listen to the language coming out of that operation. Sources close to the investigation in Banfield's reporting called the trip well worth it because the search teams did not leave empty-handed. They left with the dinghy. They left with evidence handed over by Bahamian police. And they left, per that reporting, having identified items that were not where Brian Hooker's story says they should have been. Items, not where his story says they should have been. That sentence is doing an enormous amount of work. And as of tonight, nobody outside the investigation knows what it refers to. Add it to the pile of sealed boxes this case now contains. Whatever the FLIR camera's cloud memory preserved from the night of April 4th, whatever the full GPS extraction shows beyond the fragments officials have described, whatever the surveillance footage from the Lubbers Quarters area actually captured around that anchored sailboat after midnight, whatever forensic processing of 2 seized vessels turns up, every one of those boxes is currently in federal hands, being opened by CGIS investigators who have stopped giving updates. And Ashley Banfield, the reporter who has been first on nearly every turn this case has taken, says what the Coast Guard carried home from the Bahamas is the story to watch next. That is where we will pick this up. When the contents of those boxes start to surface, and in this case they always seem to surface in the same place first, we will walk through them the same way we walked through tonight, sourced, labeled, and in order. Lynette Hooker would be spending this June at anchor somewhere beautiful. She was 55 years old, a mother, a daughter, a sailor who spent her whole life on the water and documented the dream she was finally living. She has now been missing for 69 days. Somebody knows what happened to her. The machines that watched that night are no longer keeping the secret to themselves, and neither anymore is her family. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, help is available. In the United States, the National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24 hours a day at 1-800-799-7233. If you found this breakdown valuable, please subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications because this case is moving quickly and the next development may already be unfolding as you watch this. Share your thoughts in the comments, especially if you sail these waters or know the abacos. And we will see you in the next one. This video is presented for informational and commentary purposes. Brian Hooker has not been charged with any crime in connection with the disappearance of Lynette Hooker. He has publicly and consistently denied any wrongdoing, and he is presumed innocent. The designation of Brian Hooker as a suspect is attributed exclusively to the Royal Bahamas Police Force and statements by its commissioner, not to this channel.